The fever took hold of Francis Porter 3 days into the wagon train's crossing through the Red Rock Canyons of southeastern Utah, and by the 5th day, when the company stopped to water their animals at a spring near Monticello, she could barely sit upright on the hard wooden bench of her uncle's wagon. The August heat of 1877 pressed down on the caravan like a heavy wool blanket, and Francis felt as though she were burning from the inside out, her skin blazing hot one moment and shaking with chills the next, despite the scorching sun overhead. Her uncle Edwin had taken her in after her parents died of consumption back in Missouri, promising to bring her west to start fresh in California, where his brother had established a small ranch. But Edwin was a hard man, made harder by the death of his own wife 2 winters prior, and he had little patience for weakness. When Francis collapsed trying to help his 2 young sons gather firewood that evening, he stood over her with his arms crossed, his weathered face set in grim lines. "She is slowing us down," his traveling companion Marcus Webb said, spitting tobacco juice into the dust. "We are already a week behind schedule, and the company leader says we need to make up time before the mountain passes get too cold." Francis tried to speak, to tell them she would be better soon, but her throat felt like sandpaper, and her words came out as barely a whisper. The world spun around her, the red cliffs and scrubby junipers blurring together into a nauseating swirl of color. She felt someone press a tin cup of water to her lips, tipping it too quickly so that most of it spilled down her already sweat-soaked dress. "Please," she managed to croak, "just one more day." "We have given you 5 days," Edwin said, his voice flat and emotionless. "The others are already complaining about the pace. They have families to think about, schedules to keep. Winter comes early in the mountains, Francis. We cannot risk everyone for one person." Through the haze of fever, Francis understood what he was saying before he even spoke the words. They were going to leave her. Her own uncle, the last family she had in the world, was going to abandon her in this desolate country to save himself the inconvenience of a sick ward. "There is a settlement not far from here," Edwin continued, though he would not meet her eyes. "Monticello, small place, but they have a trading post. We will leave you there with some money, and you can catch up with another wagon train once you are well. Or stay if you find work." "You cannot just leave her," a woman's voice protested. Francis recognized it as belonging to Sarah Collins, a young mother traveling with her husband and 3 children. "She is burning with fever. She needs care." "Then you care for her," Marcus Webb shot back. "You want to slow your own family down? Risk your children getting sick, too?" Sarah fell silent, and Francis felt what little hope she had crumble into dust. She understood. Sarah had her own family to protect, her own children to think about. Why would she risk their welfare for a girl she barely knew? The next hours passed in a blur of jostling movement and feverish dreams. Francis was vaguely aware of being moved, of the wagon lurching and swaying beneath her, of voices speaking in low tones. When she next opened her eyes with any real awareness, she found herself lying on a rough wooden floor inside a small adobe building. The air smelled of dust and dried herbs, and through a single small window she could see the orange glow of sunset painting the distant cliffs. "She is awake," a man's voice, unfamiliar and gruff. "About time to be moving on if we are going to make any distance before full dark," Edwin replied. Francis tried to sit up, but her body refused to cooperate. She managed to turn her head enough to see her uncle standing near the door, his hat already on his head, his hand on the latch. He had set a small leather pouch on the floor near her head, probably the money he had mentioned. "Uncle Edwin," she whispered, hating how weak and desperate she sounded. He finally looked at her then, and for just a moment, something that might have been regret flickered across his weathered features. But it was gone as quickly as it appeared, replaced by that same hard determination that had gotten him through his own wife's death and kept him moving ever forward. "The proprietor here says you can stay until you are well enough to work off the cost of the room," he said. "After that, you are on your own. I am sorry, Francis, but I have my boys to think about." Then he was gone, the door closing behind him with a soft thud that sounded as final as a coffin lid. Francis lay there listening to the sounds of the wagon train preparing to move out, the crack of whips and the calls of the drivers, the creaking of wood and leather and the plodding of hooves. The sounds grew fainter and fainter until they disappeared entirely, swallowed by the vast silence of the desert. She had never felt so alone in her entire life. Time lost all meaning after that. Frances drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes waking to find water being pressed to her lips, sometimes coming to awareness in the deep darkness of night, with no sense of how long she had been asleep. The fever raged through her body like a wildfire, burning away everything except the most basic awareness of her own suffering. She dreamed of her parents, of her mother's gentle hands smoothing her hair back from her forehead, of her father's deep laugh. She dreamed of cool water and shade, of rain on her burning skin. Once, she woke to find an elderly Mexican woman sitting beside her, pressing a cool cloth to her forehead and murmuring prayers in Spanish. The woman's face was kind, lined with deep wrinkles that spoke of a life lived under the harsh sun. But when Frances tried to thank her, the words would not come, and she slipped back under the dark waters of unconsciousness. She did not know how many days passed like this. 3, 5, a week? The world contracted down to nothing but heat and thirst and the occasional blessed coolness of water or a damp cloth. She was dying, she thought dimly during one of her brief moments of clarity. This is what dying feels like. Alone in a strange place, abandoned by the only family she had left. But then something changed. Frances became aware of new sounds, of boots on wooden floorboards and a man's voice speaking in low, urgent tones. She felt herself being lifted, strong arms sliding beneath her shoulders and knees, and then she was being carried somewhere. The movement made her stomach lurch, but she was too weak to protest. "Easy now," the man's voice said, close to her ear. "I have got you." She was laid down on something softer than the hard floor, something that smelled of sun-dried cotton and sage. A real bed, she realized with a distant sense of wonder. When had she last slept in a real bed? "Miss, can you hear me?" Frances forced her eyes open, though even that small effort felt like pushing a boulder uphill. The face that swam into view above her was young, perhaps mid-20s, with tan skin and dark hair that fell across his forehead. His eyes were a striking light brown, almost amber in the lamplight, and they looked at her with genuine concern. "There you are," he said, and despite everything, Frances heard a hint of warmth in his voice. "You have been giving old Miguel quite a scare, burning up with fever for near on a week now." "Who?" Frances started, but her voice cracked and failed. "Name is Grant Owens," the man said, reaching for a cup of water on a nearby table. "I am a cowhand with the Rocking K Ranch about 10 miles south of here. Heard in town that some wagon train had left a sick girl at Miguel's trading post, and nobody was doing much to help her." He slid a hand behind her head, supporting her as he brought the cup to her lips. "Drink slow now, just small sips." The water was the most wonderful thing Frances had ever tasted. She wanted to gulp it down, to drain the entire cup in one go, but Grant was careful to give her only small amounts at a time, waiting between each sip to make sure she could keep it down. "Why?" she whispered when he finally set the cup aside. "Why are you here?" Something flickered across Grant's face, an emotion she could not quite name. "Because somebody needed to be," he said simply. "Miguel is a good man, but he is old and he has got his own troubles. His wife Maria has been doing what she could, but they do not have much in the way of medicine or supplies. Figured I could help." "You don't know me." "No," Grant agreed, "but that does not seem like much of a reason to let you die." Over the following days, Frances learned that Grant Owens was a man of his word. He had taken a room at the trading post, telling his ranch boss that he had personal business to attend to in town, and he dedicated himself to nursing her back to health with a patience and gentleness that Frances would not have expected from a rough cowboy. He made her drink water every hour, even when she protested that she could not manage another drop. He convinced Maria to make thin broths that he fed to Frances spoonful by spoonful, encouraging her when she felt too weak to swallow. He changed the cloth on her forehead regularly, keeping it cool and damp, and when the fever spiked especially high during the nights, he stayed awake beside her bed, monitoring her breathing and making sure she did not get tangled in the sweat-soaked sheets. "You should rest," Frances told him one night when she woke to find him sitting in a chair beside her bed, his chin propped on his hand as he fought to keep his eyes open. "You cannot keep staying awake like this." Grant straightened up, rolling his shoulders to work out the stiffness. "I will rest when I know you are through the worst of it," he said. "Fever like this can turn bad quick if nobody is watching." "But why?" Frances asked, the question that had been nagging at her since he first appeared. "You do not owe me anything. You did not even know I existed until a few days ago." Grant was quiet for a long moment, his amber eyes distant in the lamplight. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft and thoughtful. About 3 years back, I was working a cattle drive up through Colorado. We got caught in an early blizzard up in the mountains, and I got separated from the rest of the outfit. Wandered around in the snow for 2 days before I finally collapsed. Would have frozen to death if a trapper had not found me and taken me back to his cabin. He paused, his jaw working. Man did not know me from Adam. Could have just left me there in the snow, but he did not. He spent a week nursing me back to health, sharing his food and his fire with a complete stranger. What happened to him? He died that same winter. Avalanche took his cabin while he was inside. Grant's expression was somber. I never got a chance to repay him for what he did, never got to thank him proper, so I figured when I heard about you, well, maybe this was a way to pay that debt forward, do for someone else what he did for me. Frances felt tears prick at her eyes, and she blinked them back. That is a very kind way to see it. Or maybe I am just too stubborn to let someone die when I could have done something to prevent it, Grant said with a slight smile that softened his features. My mother always said my stubbornness would either save me or kill me, have not figured out which yet. Despite her weakness, Frances found herself smiling back. I hope it is the former. Me too. The fever finally broke on the 8th day after Grant had taken over her care. Frances woke in the early morning to find herself drenched in sweat, but clear-headed for the first time in what felt like forever. The room came into focus around her, showing itself to be small but clean, with whitewashed adobe walls and a single window that let in the soft pink light of dawn. Grant was asleep in the chair beside her bed, his head tilted back at an angle that looked extremely uncomfortable, his hat pulled down low over his face. Frances took the opportunity to really look at him for the first time. He was lean and rangy, with the kind of build that came from long days of hard physical labor. His hands resting on his knees were calloused and scarred, the hands of a working cowboy. His clothes were simple but well-maintained, the blue shirt and leather vest showing signs of careful mending. There was something quietly capable about him, something that suggested a man who was used to solving problems and getting things done without a lot of fuss or complaint. As if sensing her scrutiny, Grant stirred and pushed his hat back, blinking in the early morning light. When he saw Frances looking at him with clear eyes, his whole face lit up. "Well now," he said, sitting up straight. "There you are. How do you feel?" "Weak," Frances admitted. "And hungry, actually. Is that a good sign?" "Best sign there is," Grant said, standing and stretching with an audible crack of his spine. "Means your body is ready to start healing proper. Let me see if Maria can rustle up some breakfast for you. Something more substantial than broth this time." He started toward the door, but Frances called him back. "Grant?" He turned, one hand on the doorframe. "Yes?" "Thank you," Frances said, putting all the feelings she could manage into those 2 simple words. "For everything. For not leaving me to die. For caring when you had no reason to." Grant's expression softened. "You are welcome, Frances. Now let me get you that breakfast before you waste away to nothing." Recovery was a slow process. The fever had burned through Frances like a fire through dry grass, leaving her weak as a newborn kitten. For the first few days after the fever broke, she could barely sit up without help, and the simple act of eating a bowl of soup left her exhausted. But Grant remained patient, helping her with tasks that would have embarrassed her if she had not been too tired to care, always respectful and kind. "You need to build your strength back up," he told her one afternoon as he helped her take a few shaky steps around the small room. His arm was solid around her waist, supporting most of her weight as her legs trembled with the effort. "I know it is frustrating, but you cannot rush this. Your body needs time." "How much time?" Frances asked, frustrated by her own weakness. "I need to find work, need to pay Miguel back for the room and board, and I need to figure out what I'm going to do next. I cannot just stay here forever." "One problem at a time," Grant said firmly. "Right now, you focus on getting well. The rest will sort itself out." But Frances could not help worrying. She had no family, no prospects, and very little money. The small pouch Edwin had left her would not last long, and she had no idea how much Miguel was charging for her care. She was stranded in a tiny settlement in the middle of nowhere, too weak to work and with no clear path forward. Grant seemed to sense her anxiety, because that evening, as he sat beside her bed, helping her eat a simple dinner of beans and cornbread, he brought up the subject himself. "I have been thinking," he said carefully, about what you are going to do once you are well enough. Frances set down her spoon, her appetite suddenly gone. I have been thinking about that too. I suppose I will need to find work here in Monticello until I can save enough for passage on another wagon train. Or perhaps I could find a position as a housekeeper or something similar. Monticello is a small place, Grant said slowly. There are not a lot of opportunities for work here, especially for a woman on her own. Most of the folks here are ranching families or traders. I know, Frances said quietly. But what choice do I have? Grant was quiet for a moment, seeming to wrestle with something. Finally, he said, The Rocking K Ranch where I work, they are always needing help with cooking and washing and such. The outfit is mostly cowboys, and none of them are much good at keeping themselves or their quarters clean. The boss, Mr. Kelton, he has been talking about hiring someone to handle the domestic work, so his wife does not have to manage it all herself. Frances looked at him, hope blooming in her chest. Do you think he would consider me? I could ask, Grant said. I have been with the Rocking K for 3 years now, and Mr. Kelton trusts my judgment. If I vouch for you, I think he would be willing to give you a try. That would be wonderful, Frances said, relief flooding through her. I am a good worker, I promise. I can cook and clean and mend and do laundry. I helped my mother run our household back in Missouri, and I helped my aunt before she died. I believe you, Grant said with a gentle smile. But you need to be fully recovered first. Mr. Kelton is a fair man, but he expects a full day's work for a full day's pay. You are not ready for that yet. How long do you think? Grant considered her thoughtfully. Another week, maybe 2. You need to be able to walk around without getting winded, need to put some weight back on. Right now you look like a strong breeze would blow you over. Frances knew he was right, but the waiting was hard. She had been raised to be useful, to contribute, and lying around being cared for by others went against every instinct she had. But she also understood that pushing herself too hard too fast would only set back her recovery. So she focused on doing what Grant told her, eating everything he brought her even when she felt too full, taking slow walks around the trading post when she felt strong enough, resting when her body demanded it. And through it all, Grant was there, patient and encouraging, celebrating small victories like when she managed to walk all the way outside to the porch and back without needing his arm for support. The trading post itself was a fascinating place. Miguel, the elderly proprietor, was a former trader who had settled in Monticello after his traveling days were over. His wife Maria had been born in the area, the daughter of Mexican settlers who had established a small ranch nearby. They ran the trading post together, selling supplies to the ranchers and miners and occasional travelers who passed through the remote settlement. As Frances grew stronger, she began to insist on helping with small tasks around the trading post, partly to feel useful and partly to try to work off some of the debt she owed for her care. Maria was happy to have the assistance, teaching Frances how to make tortillas and showing her the local herbs that grew wild in the canyons and how they could be used for cooking and medicine. This one, we call it OSHA, Maria said one afternoon, showing Frances a bundle of dried roots hanging from the ceiling of the trading post's kitchen. Very good for fevers and coughs. I used it to help bring your fever down when you first came here. It worked, Frances said gratefully, along with everything else you and Grant did for me. Maria smiled, her weathered face crinkling with warmth. That Grant, he is a good boy. He comes here sometimes to help Miguel with heavy lifting, never asks for anything in return. When he heard you were here and sick, he did not hesitate, just showed up and said he was going to make sure you got better. He told me about the trapper who saved him in Colorado, Frances said, about how he wants to pay that kindness forward. Yes, that is part of it, Maria agreed. But I think there is more to it than that. Grant, he has a good heart, but he is lonely. His parents died when he was young, and he has been on his own ever since. I think maybe taking care of you, it reminds him what it is like to have someone to care about. Frances felt her cheeks warm slightly. We are just friends. He is being kind to someone in need. Of course, Maria said, but her knowing smile suggested she saw something Frances was not quite ready to acknowledge yet. The truth was that Frances found herself thinking about Grant more and more as the days passed. She looked forward to his visits, to the sound of his boots on the wooden floor and the way his face lit up when he saw she was making progress. She appreciated his quiet strength, the way he could be both gentle and capable at the same time, and she found herself noticing little things about him, the way his eyes crinkled at the corners when he smiled, the sound of his laugh when Maria teased him in Spanish, the careful way he handled everything he touched. But she pushed these thoughts aside. Grant was helping her out of kindness, nothing more. The last thing she wanted was to read too much into his actions and make things awkward between them. Besides, she had nothing to offer him. She was penniless, alone, and completely dependent on the charity of others. What could a man like Grant possibly see in someone like her? 2 weeks after the fever broke, Grant declared Frances ready to make the trip to the Rocking K Ranch. She had regained enough strength to walk around the trading post without difficulty, and she had put back on some of the weight she had lost during her illness. She still tired more easily than she would have liked, but she was determined to prove that she could pull her weight. The morning they were set to leave, Frances helped Maria prepare breakfast one last time, moving around the small kitchen with a competence that made the older woman beam with pride. "You have learned well," Maria said, hugging Frances tightly. "You come back and visit us, yes? And if that ranch does not treat you right, you come back here. We will find something for you." "Thank you, Maria," Frances said, her throat tight with emotion. "For everything. You and Miguel saved my life." "Grant saved your life," Maria corrected gently. "We just helped a little bit. Now go on. He is waiting for you, and it is a long ride to the ranch." Frances had been expecting a wagon, so she was surprised when she stepped outside to find Grant standing beside 2 horses. One was a tall bay gelding that she assumed was his own mount, and the other was a smaller sorrel mare with a gentle eye. "I hope you can ride," Grant said, seeing her hesitation. "A wagon would take too long, and I need to get back to work. Mr. Kelton has been patient, but I have been away longer than I originally planned." "I can ride," Frances assured him, though it had been several years since she had been on a horse. "My father taught me when I was young." "Good. This is Clover," Grant said, stroking the mare's neck. "She is gentle as a lamb. Belonged to Mr. Kelton's daughter before she got married and moved to Denver. She has been needing exercise anyway." Grant helped Frances into the saddle, his hands strong and steady as he made sure she was seated securely. Then he swung up onto his own horse with the easy grace of someone who had spent most of his life in the saddle. The ride to the Rocking K Ranch took them south through stunning Red Rock country. The August morning was already warm, but a light breeze kept the heat from being oppressive. Frances found herself captivated by the landscape, so different from the green hills and forests of Missouri. Here everything was painted in shades of red and orange and ochre, with deep blue sky stretching endlessly overhead and distant purple mountains on the horizon. "It is beautiful," she said, as they rode side by side along a dusty trail that wound between towering sandstone cliffs. "It grows on you," Grant agreed. "When I first came out here from Texas, I thought it was the most desolate country I had ever seen. But after a while, you start to appreciate the beauty in it, the way the light changes throughout the day, the colors in the rocks, the way the whole landscape seems to glow during sunset." "How long have you been in Utah?" "About 4 years now. I worked on ranches down in Texas after my parents died, but I got tired of the heat and the crowds. Heard there was work to be had in Utah territory, so I drifted north. Ended up at the Rocking K and decided to stay. Mr. Kelton is a good man to work for, and the country suits me." They rode in comfortable silence for a while, Frances concentrating on staying balanced in the saddle, and Grant keeping an eye on her to make sure she was managing all right. Despite her time recovering, Frances could feel her muscles beginning to ache from the unaccustomed exercise, but she was determined not to complain. "Tell me about the Rocking K," she said after a while, partly to distract herself from her discomfort, and partly because she wanted to know what she was getting herself into. "What is it like?" "It is a good-sized operation," Grant said. "Mr. Kelton runs about 3,000 head of cattle, mostly Herefords, and he has got about 30,000 acres of grazing land. The main ranch house is pretty nice, built of stone and timber. Then there is the bunkhouse where the hands sleep, the cookhouse, the barns and corrals. Mrs. Kelton, she has been managing the cooking and cleaning with help from a couple of local women who come in during the week. But she has been after her husband to hire someone full-time. She has been wanting to spend more time working with her horses." "Horses?" Grant nodded. "Mrs. Kelton breeds and trains horses. Good ones, too. She has got an eye for bloodlines and a gift for gentling even the most stubborn animals. But she cannot do that and manage the house at the same time, so she has been stretched pretty thin. I hope I can be of help, Francis said, suddenly nervous. It sounds like a big operation. You will do fine, Grant said with confidence. Mrs. Kelton is a good woman, very fair. She does not expect perfection, just honest work. And the hands are decent fellows for the most part. A few are rough around the edges, but they will not give you any trouble. I will make sure of that. Something in the way he said those last words, firm and protective, made Francis glance over at him. Grant was looking straight ahead, but she could see the set of his jaw, the determined line of his shoulders. He meant what he said. He would look out for her, make sure she was safe and treated well. The realization made something warm unfold in Francis's chest. When had anyone last looked out for her like this? When had anyone last made her feel like she mattered, like her well-being was important? They reached the Rocking K Ranch around midday, and Francis's first glimpse of the place took her breath away. The ranch was situated in a broad valley surrounded by red cliffs, with a creek running through the property that created a ribbon of green through the arid landscape. The buildings Grant had described were arranged in a neat compound, the main house standing proud at the center, with the working buildings spread out around it. As they rode into the yard, several cowboys stopped what they were doing to watch their arrival with open curiosity. Grant nodded to them, but rode directly to the main house, where a woman was sitting on the wide front porch shelling peas into a bowl. Mrs. Kelton, Grant called out, swinging down from his horse. I am back, and I brought someone I would like you to meet. The woman set aside her bowl and stood, shading her eyes with one hand as she studied Francis. She was in her early 40s, Francis guessed, with dark hair streaked with gray and a sturdy, capable build. Her face was weathered from sun and wind, but there was kindness in her blue eyes. Grant helped Francis dismount, steadying her when her legs wobbled slightly after the long ride. This is Frances Porter, he said, the young woman I told you about in my message. Francis, this is Mrs. Elizabeth Kelton. A pleasure to meet you, Mrs. Kelton, Francis said, smoothing down her travel-dusty skirt self-consciously. Grant has told me wonderful things about your ranch. Has he now? Elizabeth said with a slight smile. Well, Grant tends to be loyal to those who treat him fairly, so I will take that as a compliment. Come inside, both of you. You must be exhausted from the ride, and I imagine you would appreciate some lunch. The interior of the ranch house was even more impressive than the outside. The main room was large and airy, with exposed timber beams and a massive stone fireplace at one end. The furniture was sturdy and well made, and there were colorful woven rugs on the polished wood floors. Everything was clean, but clearly lived in, the kind of home where people actually worked and lived rather than a showplace. Elizabeth led them to a large kitchen at the back of the house and quickly assembled a meal of cold chicken, fresh bread, and pickled vegetables. As they ate, Grant explained the situation to Elizabeth in more detail, telling her about how Francis's wagon train had abandoned her and how he had spent the past few weeks helping her recover. That is shameful, Elizabeth said when he finished, her expression disapproving. Leaving a young woman alone and sick in a strange place. What kind of people do such a thing? People who put their own interests first, Francis said quietly. I understand why my uncle did it. He had his own children to think about, and I was slowing the train down. Understanding it does not make it right, Elizabeth said firmly. But what is done is done. The question now is what we are going to do moving forward. Grant says you are looking for work. Yes, madam, Francis said, sitting up straighter. I am a hard worker, and I know how to cook and clean and do all manner of household tasks. I understand you might need help managing the house, and I would be grateful for the opportunity. Elizabeth studied her for a long moment, her sharp eyes taking in everything from Francis's worn dress to her still too thin frame. You have been very sick, she said finally. Are you sure you are ready for this kind of work? It would be long days and hard labor. I need someone reliable. I am ready, Francis said with more confidence than she felt. I will not let you down, Mrs. Kelton. I promise. She kept up fine on the ride from Monticello, Grant added, and she has been helping Maria at the trading post this past week. She is stronger than she looks. Elizabeth glanced at Grant, and something passed between them that Francis could not quite read. Then the older woman nodded. All right, we will give it a try. The position comes with room and board, plus $15 a month. You will have Sundays off unless there is some special occasion that requires extra help. Your quarters will be in the small house behind the main building. It used to be where my mother-in-law lived before she passed. It is modest, but comfortable. That sounds more than fair, Frances said, relief flooding through her. Thank you, Mrs. Kelton. You will not regret this. See that I do not, Elizabeth said, but there was warmth in her tone. Now, Grant, you had better get yourself over to the foreman. Tom has been covering your work while you were gone, but I am sure he will be happy to hand it back over. Frances, why do not you come with me, and I will show you where you will be staying. You can get settled in today, and we will start fresh in the morning. The small house Elizabeth showed Frances to was indeed modest, consisting of just 2 rooms and a tiny kitchen area, but it was clean and well-maintained. There was a bed with a real mattress, a small table and chairs, a wood stove for cooking and heat, and even a few personal touches like curtains on the windows and a colorful quilt on the bed. My mother-in-law made that quilt, Elizabeth said, seeing Frances running her hand over the carefully pieced fabric. She was a fine seamstress. I thought you might appreciate it. It is beautiful, Frances said honestly. This whole place is wonderful, Mrs. Kelton, much nicer than I expected. We take care of our own here at the Rocking K, Elizabeth said. You work hard for us, and we will make sure you are comfortable. Now, I will let you rest this afternoon since you have had a long ride. Come up to the main house around 5 o'clock, and we will go over your duties and what I will be expecting from you. After Elizabeth left, Frances sat down on the bed and looked around her new home, hardly able to believe her good fortune. Just 3 weeks ago, she had been dying of fever, abandoned by her only family, and with no prospects whatsoever. Now she had a job, a place to live, and the beginnings of a new life in this strange and beautiful country. And she had Grant to thank for all of it. The thought of Grant made her cheeks warm again. She wondered where he was now, what he was doing, whether he was thinking about her at all. Probably not, she told herself firmly. He had done his good deed, and now he would go back to his regular life. She would see him around the ranch, of course, but things would be different now. He would not have any reason to spend time with her, to sit by her bedside and talk to her and make sure she was eating enough. The realization made her feel unexpectedly lonely. Over the past weeks, she had grown used to Grant's constant presence, his quiet strength and gentle humor. What would it be like to not have that anymore? Frances shook herself. This was foolish thinking. She needed to focus on her new position, on proving herself capable and earning her place here at the Rocking K. She could not afford to get distracted by romantic notions about a cowboy who had simply been kind to someone in need. But as she lay down to rest before her meeting with Mrs. Kelton, her last thoughts before drifting off were of amber eyes and gentle hands and a voice saying, "I have got you." The work at the Rocking K proved to be every bit as demanding as Elizabeth had warned. Frances rose before dawn each morning to get the cookhouse stove going and prepare breakfast for the ranch hands, usually somewhere between 15 and 20 men, depending on the season. After breakfast, she cleaned up and then moved on to the main house, where she helped Elizabeth with laundry, cleaning, mending, and preparing the midday and evening meals. It was exhausting work, made more so by the fact that Frances was still not fully recovered from her illness. For the first few days, she pushed herself to the point of collapse, determined to prove that Elizabeth had not made a mistake in hiring her. She fell into bed each night with her muscles screaming and her hands raw from washing and scrubbing. But Elizabeth noticed, of course. On Frances's 4th day at the ranch, the older woman took the scrub brush out of her hands and pointed toward a chair. "Sit," she ordered. "But I am not finished with the floors," Frances protested. "The floors will still be there in an hour. Sit down before you fall down." Reluctantly, Frances sat. Elizabeth poured 2 cups of coffee and joined her at the kitchen table, studying her with those sharp blue eyes. "You are trying too hard," Elizabeth said bluntly. "I appreciate the work ethic, truly I do, but you are going to make yourself sick again if you keep pushing like this." "I just want to prove that I can do the job," Frances said tiredly, "that you were right to give me a chance." "You have already proven that," Elizabeth said firmly. "You are a good worker, Frances, but good workers also know their own limits. There is no shame in needing to build up your strength gradually. You were very ill not long ago. Your body needs time to adjust to this level of labor. But what if you decide I am not worth the trouble?" Elizabeth reached across the table and patted Frances's hand. "I have been running this ranch alongside my husband for 23 years. In that time, I have hired and fired more people than I can count. I can spot a worthwhile worker within a few days. And you, my dear, are definitely worthwhile. But you are no good to me if you work yourself into the ground. So from now on, you are going to take breaks when I tell you to. Understand?" Frances felt tears prick at her eyes, moved by the kindness in Elizabeth's voice. "Yes, madam. Thank you." "Good. Now drink your coffee, and then you can finish those floors at a reasonable pace." After that conversation, things became a bit easier. Frances still worked hard, but she learned to pace herself, to take breaks when she needed them, to ask for help with the heavier tasks. And as the days turned into weeks, she felt herself growing stronger, her stamina increasing until she could make it through a full day without feeling like she might collapse. She also began to feel at home at the Rocking K. Elizabeth was a fair but exacting employer, but she was also generous with praise when it was deserved and patient when Frances made mistakes. The ranch hands were respectful, tipping their hats when they saw her and thanking her for meals. And the work itself, while demanding, gave Frances a sense of purpose and accomplishment that she had been lacking. The only shadow on her contentment was that she rarely saw Grant. He was out with the cattle most days, riding the range to check on the herds and mend fences and do all the other countless tasks required to keep a ranch running. Sometimes she would catch a glimpse of him riding in or out of the ranch yard, and they would exchange waves. Occasionally he would be present for a meal in the cookhouse, and he always made a point of complimenting her cooking and asking how she was settling in. But they never had a chance to really talk, not like they had during those weeks when he was caring for her. Frances told herself this was for the best, that she needed to focus on her work and not get distracted. But she could not help feeling a pang of loss for the easy companionship they had shared. Then one Sunday, her day off, Frances was sitting on the small porch of her cottage reading a book Elizabeth had lent her when she heard the sound of approaching footsteps. She looked up to find Grant walking toward her, dressed in clean clothes rather than his usual work gear, his hat in his hands. "Afternoon, Frances," he said with that warm smile that always made her heart skip a beat. "I hope I'm not disturbing you?" "Not at all," Frances said, setting aside her book and feeling suddenly self-conscious. "I was just reading. Is everything all right?" "Everything is fine. I just realized I have not really had a chance to check in with you since you started working here. Wanted to see how you're doing, make sure you are settling in all right." "I am doing well," Frances assured him. "Mrs. Kelton has been very kind, and the work keeps me busy. Thank you for arranging all this. I know I have said it before, but I do not think I can ever thank you enough for everything you have done for me." Grant shifted his weight, looking uncomfortable with the gratitude. "You do not need to keep thanking me. I am just glad you are doing better." He hesitated, then added, "I have actually been meaning to ask you something. There is a church social next Saturday evening in Monticello. Nothing fancy, just music and dancing and food. I was wondering if you might like to go. With me, I mean." Frances felt her breath catch. Was Grant asking to court her? Or was this just a friendly invitation? She wished she could read his expression better, but he was looking down at his hat, turning it in his hands. "I would like that very much," she said softly. Grant looked up, his face brightening. "Really? That is good. That is really good. I will arrange for a wagon, make it comfortable for you. We can head out Saturday afternoon, and I will have you back at a reasonable hour." "That sounds perfect." Grant grinned, and Frances realized it was the first time she had seen him look genuinely happy and relaxed since they had arrived at the ranch. "Well, all right then. I will let you get back to your book. See you Saturday, Frances." "See you Saturday, Grant." Frances watched him walk away, her heart racing. A church social, an evening out with Grant. It might not be a formal declaration of courtship, but it was definitely something that made her feel warm and hopeful and excited in a way she had not felt in a very long time. The week leading up to Saturday seemed to drag by with painful slowness. Frances found herself thinking about the social constantly, wondering what she would wear and what the evening would be like. She owned only 2 dresses, both rather worn and outdated, and she spent her spare time that week carefully mending and refreshing them as best she could. Elizabeth noticed her distraction and finally asked about it on Thursday evening as they were preparing dinner. "You seem preoccupied," the older woman observed. "Something on your mind?" Frances hesitated, then decided there was no point in hiding it. "Grant asked me to attend the church social with him on Saturday. I'm just a bit nervous, I suppose." Elizabeth's eyebrows rose, but she looked pleased rather than disapproving. "Did he now? Well, that is interesting. Is it all right? Francis asked anxiously. I know Saturday evenings can be busy, but it is technically my day off, and I will make sure all my work is done before I leave. Of course it is all right, Elizabeth said, waving away her concerns. You are entitled to have a life outside of work, Francis, and Grant is a good man. You could do much worse. I am not sure if he is courting me or just being friendly, Francis admitted. We spent a lot of time together when I was sick, and I think he feels responsible for me in a way. I do not want to read too much into it. Elizabeth gave her a knowing look. Francis, I have known Grant Owens for 3 years. He is friendly with everyone, yes, but he has never asked any woman to accompany him to a social event. If he is inviting you, it means something. The words gave Francis a flutter of hope mixed with nervousness. What if Elizabeth was right? What if Grant was interested in her as more than just a friend or someone he felt obligated to help? The possibility was both thrilling and terrifying. I do not have anything nice to wear, Francis said quietly. Everything I own is worn out or outdated. Elizabeth studied her for a moment, then set down the knife she had been using to chop vegetables. Come with me. She led Francis upstairs to a large bedroom that was clearly her personal space. Opening a wardrobe, she pulled out a dress in a deep rose color with delicate lace trim at the collar and cuffs. This was mine when I was about your age, Elizabeth said, holding it up against Francis. I have kept it all these years thinking maybe I would have a daughter who could wear it, but I only ever had sons. I think it would fit you well enough with a few minor adjustments. Mrs. Kelton, I could not, Francis protested, even as her fingers itched to touch the beautiful fabric. It is too fine. Nonsense. It is just sitting in my wardrobe gathering dust. You would be doing me a favor by wearing it. Elizabeth's expression softened. Besides, I like you, Francis. You remind me of myself at your age, trying to make your own way in the world. Let me do this for you. Francis felt tears well up in her eyes. You have already done so much for me. You and Grant both. I do not know how I will ever repay such kindness. By living a good life and being happy, Elizabeth said firmly. That is all the repayment I need. Now, let us see about making sure this dress fits properly. We have 2 days to work with. Saturday arrived with brilliant sunshine and a light breeze that kept the August heat from being oppressive. Frances spent the morning and early afternoon finishing her regular chores, working quickly so that she would have time to prepare herself properly for the evening. At 3 o'clock, she returned to her cottage and carefully washed using the water she had heated on the stove, then took her time with her hair, pinning it up in a style that was more elaborate than her usual practical bun. Finally, she put on the rose-colored dress Elizabeth had altered to fit her perfectly. Looking at herself in the small mirror above her washstand, Frances hardly recognized her own reflection. The dress brought out the color in her cheeks and made her green eyes look brighter. Her hair, usually pulled back severely for work, softened her features when arranged more loosely. She looked, she realized with some surprise, pretty. A knock at her door made her jump. She opened it to find Grant standing there, and the expression on his face when he saw her made all her nervous preparation worthwhile. "Frances," he said, his voice slightly breathless. "You look beautiful." "Thank you," Frances said, feeling her cheeks warm. "You look very nice yourself." Grant was dressed in what were clearly his Sunday best clothes, a clean white shirt and dark trousers, with a vest and a string tie. His hair was neatly combed back, and he smelled faintly of soap and leather. He offered her his arm. "The wagon is ready whenever you are." The ride to Monticello was pleasant, the wagon seat made comfortable with cushions and blankets. Grant kept up an easy conversation, telling Frances about the ranch work and asking about her experiences working with Elizabeth. There was none of the awkwardness Frances had feared, just the same comfortable companionship they had shared during her recovery. The church social was being held in the main building of the trading post, which had been cleared of merchandise and decorated with bunting and lanterns. By the time Grant and Frances arrived, the place was already filling up with people from the surrounding ranches and farms. Maria spotted them immediately and came over with a delighted smile. "Frances, you look wonderful. And Grant, you finally bring her to visit us." She leaned in and whispered conspiratorially to Frances, "I told you he had feelings for you." Frances blushed furiously while Grant cleared his throat. "Is there food, Maria?" I promised Frances refreshments. Maria laughed and pointed them toward a long table laden with dishes brought by various attendees. As they filled their plates, several people came over to greet Grant and be introduced to Francis. Everyone seemed to know Grant and think well of him, and they welcomed Francis warmly once they learned she was working at the Rocking K. After they had eaten, a group of men with fiddles and guitars began playing music, and couples moved to the center of the room to dance. Grant turned to Francis, looking suddenly nervous. "Would you like to dance? I should warn you, I am not very good at it." "I am probably worse," Francis admitted, "but I would still like to try." Grant took her hand and led her onto the floor, placing one hand respectfully at her waist while holding her other hand in his. The music was a simple waltz, and they moved together somewhat awkwardly at first, both concentrating on not stepping on each other's feet. But as the dance went on, Francis found herself relaxing into the movement, following Grant's lead more naturally. She became aware of how close they were standing, of the warmth of his hand at her waist, of the way he was looking at her with an expression that made her heart race. "I am glad you came with me tonight," Grant said quietly, his voice just loud enough for her to hear over the music. "I have been wanting to do this for a while now." "Why did you not ask sooner?" Grant looked uncomfortable. "I was not sure if it would be appropriate. You work for the Keltons, and I did not want to make things difficult for you. But Tom, the foreman, he finally told me I was being an idiot and that if I had feelings for you, I should just tell you, instead of mooning around like a lovesick calf." Francis could not help but laugh at the image. "Were you really mooning around?" "According to Tom, yes, and apparently everyone on the ranch has noticed except you." "I did not think you would be interested in me," Francis admitted. "I thought you were just being kind, helping someone who needed it." Grant pulled her slightly closer, his expression serious. "I was helping someone who needed it, yes. But, Francis, somewhere along the way, it became more than that. Spending all that time with you, getting to know you, watching you fight to get better, and then seeing how hard you work and how determined you are, I realized I was falling for you." Francis felt like her heart might burst. "I have been falling for you too," she whispered, "from the moment you turned back to help me when everyone else had left me behind." The song ended, but neither of them moved for a moment, just standing there looking at each other while the other couples dispersed around them. Then Grant smiled, that warm, genuine smile that Francis had come to love, and led her off the floor to a quieter corner where they could talk more privately. They spent the rest of the evening together, talking and laughing, sharing stories from their pasts and dreams for their futures. Francis learned that Grant hoped to have his own small ranch someday, just a few hundred acres where he could raise horses and cattle. He talked about the kind of life he wanted to build, simple but honest, with people he cared about around him. And Francis found herself sharing things she had never told anyone, about how lost she had felt after her parents died, how her uncle had taken her in out of obligation rather than love, how scared she had been when the fever took hold and she thought she might die alone in a strange place. "You are not alone anymore," Grant said, taking her hand in his. "You have got friends here. You have got the Keltons, and Maria and Miguel, and you have got me, if you want me." "I want you," Francis said softly but firmly. "I definitely want you." Grant lifted her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles gently. "Then we will figure this out together. I know it is early days yet, and we should probably court properly for a while before making any big decisions. But I want you to know that I am serious about this, Francis, about you, about us." "I am serious too," Francis promised. "You saved my life, Grant, and now I want to build a life with you." As the social wound down and Grant drove Francis back to the Rocking K Ranch under a sky full of stars, she felt happier than she had in years. The future that had seemed so bleak and uncertain just a few weeks ago now seemed bright with possibility. She had found work she could be proud of, a place she was beginning to think of as home, and a man who looked at her like she was something precious and worth cherishing. When they reached the ranch, Grant walked her to her cottage door, and for a moment they just stood there, neither quite ready to say goodnight. "Thank you for a wonderful evening," Francis said. "Thank you for saying yes when I asked," Grant replied. He hesitated, then leaned down and kissed her forehead gently. "Sleep well, Francis. I will see you tomorrow." Francis went to bed that night with her heart full of joy and hope, already looking forward to tomorrow and all the tomorrows that would follow. The courtship that followed was conducted with propriety and care, always mindful of Francis's position at the ranch and the need to maintain proper appearances. Grant would visit her on Sunday afternoons, and they would take walks around the ranch property, talking about everything and nothing. Occasionally, when Grant had business in Monticello, Francis would get permission to accompany him, and they would stop at the trading post to visit Maria and Miguel, who both clearly approved of their relationship. Elizabeth and her husband Thaddeus Kelton also approved, making it clear that they had no objections to Grant courting someone in their employ as long as it did not interfere with anyone's work. If anything, Elizabeth seemed pleased, often making comments about how nice it was to see two good people finding happiness together. As autumn arrived and the intense heat of summer faded into cooler weather, Frances felt herself falling more deeply in love with Grant with each passing day. He was everything she could have hoped for in a partner, kind, hard-working, honest, and utterly devoted to her. He brought her wildflowers he found while out on the range, helped her carry water when he saw she was struggling with the heavy buckets, and made her laugh with stories about the other ranch hands and their various mishaps. And Frances did her best to show Grant that she cared for him, too. She made his favorite foods when it was her turn to plan the meals, mended his clothes when she noticed they needed repair, and listened with genuine interest when he talked about his dreams for the future. By October, it was clear to everyone at the Rocking K that Grant and Frances were serious about each other. Tom, the foreman, started teasing Grant about when he was going to make it official, and the other ranch hands began making bets on how soon there would be a wedding. Grant himself was just waiting for the right moment. He had been saving his wages carefully for years, hoping eventually to have enough to buy some land of his own. He had been looking at a small property about 5 miles from the Rocking K, just 200 acres with a creek running through it and good grazing land. If he could secure that property, he would have something real to offer Frances, something more than just promises and dreams. In mid-November, the opportunity came. The owner of the property Grant had been watching, an older rancher named Samuel Pierce, decided to sell and move to California to be near his grandchildren. He offered Grant first refusal on the land at a fair price, and with the money Grant had saved plus a small loan from Mr. Kelton, he was able to make the purchase. The day the deed was signed, Grant rode back to the Rocking K with his heart pounding and his mind made up. He found Frances in the cookhouse, cleaning up after the evening meal. She looked up when he entered, her face lighting up in that way that always made his chest feel tight. "Grant, I was not expecting you this evening. Is everything all right?" "Everything is perfect," Grant said, taking her hands in his. They were alone in the cookhouse, the other ranch hands having already dispersed for the evening, and he was grateful for the privacy. "Frances, I need to talk to you about something important." Frances looked at him with concern. "You are worrying me. What is it?" "Do not be worried. It is good news, I promise." He took a deep breath, then plunged ahead. "I bought some land today. 200 acres with a creek and good grass, just 5 miles east of here. It is not much, but it is a start. Enough to run a small herd and build a decent house." Frances's eyes widened. "Grant, that is wonderful. I know how long you have been wanting your own place." "I want it to be our place," Grant said, his voice steady despite his nerves. "Frances Porter, I love you. I have loved you since those nights I sat beside your bed in Monticello, watching you fight so hard to live. You are the strongest, bravest, kindest woman I have ever known, and I want to spend the rest of my life with you. Will you marry me?" For a moment, Frances just stared at him, her green eyes shining with unshed tears. Then she threw her arms around his neck, laughing and crying at the same time. "Yes! Yes, of course I will marry you." Grant wrapped his arms around her and held her close, feeling like the luckiest man in all of Utah territory. When they finally pulled apart, Frances was smiling through her tears. "I love you too," she said. "I have been wanting to tell you that for weeks, but I was afraid it was too soon." "It is not too soon," Grant assured her. "Not for something this right." They talked late into the evening, making plans for their future. They would marry in the spring, Grant decided, giving him time to build at least a basic house on their new property. Frances would continue working at the Rocking K until then, saving her wages toward furnishing their home. And after they were married, Frances would focus on making their little ranch a home, while Grant worked to build up their herd. "We will start small," Grant said, "but we will work hard and build something good together, something that is truly ours." "I do not need grand things," Frances said, touching his face gently. "I just need you." You turned back for me when everyone else left me behind. You gave me my life back. Everything else is just extra. I will spend the rest of my life making sure you never regret saying yes, Grant promised. The news of their engagement was received with joy and celebration at the Rocking K. Elizabeth hugged Francis tightly and declared that she had known from the start that Grant and Francis belonged together. Mr. Kelton shook Grant's hand and offered him advice about building a house and starting a ranch. The other cowboys congratulated Grant with good-natured ribbing about him being foolish enough to give up his freedom, though everyone could see they were genuinely happy for him. Maria and Miguel, when they heard the news on Grant and Francis's next trip to Monticello, were delighted. Maria wept happy tears and insisted on making a special meal to celebrate, while Miguel brought out a bottle of wine he had been saving for a special occasion. I knew it would happen, Maria said, beaming at them both. From the moment Grant came here and said he would take care of you, I knew. This is how love should be. He saw you when you needed someone most, and he did not turn away. The winter months passed quickly as Grant worked every spare moment on building a house on their new property. It was hard labor, made harder by the cold weather, but he refused to let anything slow him down. Other ranch hands helped when they could, and even Mr. Kelton lent a hand on a few occasions, saying that a man should have a solid roof over his head before bringing a wife home. Frances spent the winter preparing in her own way, sewing curtains and quilts, saving every penny of her wages, and learning everything she could from Elizabeth about managing a household on a limited budget. Elizabeth was generous with advice, and even more generous with wedding gifts, giving Frances dishes and cooking pots and linens that she said she no longer needed. As winter gave way to spring, the house on Grant and Frances's property began to take shape. It was small, just 4 rooms, but it was solidly built with thick walls and a good roof. Grant built a porch across the front where they could sit in the evenings, and he dug a well so Frances would have easy access to water. He also built a small barn for their horses, and the few head of cattle he had been able to purchase. They set the wedding date for the first Saturday in May, planning a simple ceremony at the small church in Monticello, followed by a celebration at the Rocking K Ranch. Frances sewed her own wedding dress with help from Elizabeth and Maria, using white cotton fabric that Elizabeth had ordered specially from Denver. It was not fancy, but it was clean and pretty and made Frances feel like a bride. The night before the wedding, Frances lay in bed in her little cottage at the Rocking K, too excited to sleep. She thought about everything that had happened since that terrible day when her uncle had left her behind. How scared and alone she had felt. How certain she had been that she was going to die in that dusty trading post with no one to mourn her. And then Grant had appeared like an answer to a prayer she had not even known to pray. He had not just saved her life. He had given her a reason to want to live. He had shown her kindness when she had nothing to offer in return, had cared for her when she was at her weakest and most vulnerable, and somehow, impossibly, he had fallen in love with her just as she had fallen in love with him. Tomorrow, she would become Mrs. Grant Owens. Tomorrow, she would start a new life with the man who had turned back when everyone else moved on. And Frances knew, with a certainty that went bone deep, that she was the luckiest woman alive. The wedding day dawned clear and beautiful, with a gentle breeze carrying the scent of sage and wildflowers. Frances dressed carefully in her white cotton gown, her hands trembling slightly as she fastened the tiny buttons. Elizabeth came to help with her hair, arranging it in soft curls with a few white flowers tucked in. "You look absolutely beautiful," Elizabeth said, her eyes damp with tears. "Grant is a very lucky man." "I am the lucky one," Frances replied. "Without your kindness and his, I do not know where I would be right now. Probably dead in that trading post, or struggling alone with no prospects." "You are stronger than you think," Elizabeth said, squeezing her hands. "You would have found a way to survive, but I am glad you did not have to do it alone. Everyone needs someone to lean on sometimes." The ceremony itself was simple, but heartfelt. Grant stood at the front of the small church in Monticello, dressed in a new suit that Frances knew represented a significant expenditure for him, looking nervous and happy and handsome. When Frances walked down the aisle on Mr. Kelton's arm, since she had no family of her own to give her away, Grant's face lit up with such pure joy that Frances felt tears spring to her eyes. They spoke their vows in steady voices, promising to love and honor each other through all the challenges life might bring. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife and told Grant he could kiss his bride, Grant cupped Frances's face gently in his calloused hands and kissed her with a tenderness that made her heart overflow. The celebration afterward at the Rocking K was joyful and boisterous, with food and music and dancing. All the ranch hands attended, along with Maria and Miguel and various neighbors from the surrounding area. People brought gifts, practical things like tools and blankets and preserves, the kinds of things a young couple would need when starting out. As the sun began to set, painting the red cliffs in shades of gold and orange, Grant and Frances slipped away from the celebration. They rode together on Grant's horse to their new property, to the little house that would be their home. Grant helped Frances down from the horse, then surprised her by sweeping her up in his arms. "I believe this is traditional," he said with a grin, carrying her across the threshold of their new home. Inside, the house was simple, but clean and ready for them. Frances had spent the previous week making sure everything was in order, hanging the curtains she had sewn, arranging the dishes Elizabeth had given them, making up the bed with the quilts Maria had contributed as a wedding gift. Grant set Frances down gently, and for a moment they just stood there in the middle of their new home, holding each other close. "I cannot believe this is real," Frances whispered, "that we are really here, that this is our home." "It is real," Grant assured her. "And it is just the beginning, Frances. We are going to build a good life here together. I promise you that." "We already have a good life," Frances said, looking up at him. "We have each other. Everything else is just details." That night, as they lay together in their marriage bed, Frances thought about how far she had come from that desperate, fevered girl who had been abandoned in Monticello. She had been given a second chance at life, and she was determined to make the most of it. With Grant by her side, she felt like she could face anything. The years that followed proved both challenging and rewarding. Running a small ranch required constant work and careful management. Grant worked from dawn to dusk, tending their small herd of cattle, mending fences, building corrals, clearing land. Frances worked equally hard, managing the household, tending a large garden that provided much of their food, preserving meat and vegetables for the winter, making butter and cheese to sell in Monticello. Money was tight, especially in those first years, but they made do. Grant occasionally took on extra work at the Rocking K when they needed cash, and Frances sometimes sold her baked goods at the trading post. They learned to be resourceful, to make things last, to find joy in simple pleasures. But through all the hard work and challenges, their love for each other only grew stronger. Grant was an attentive and caring husband, always making sure Frances knew how much he appreciated her efforts, always ready with a hug or a kind word when she was tired or discouraged. And Frances made sure Grant knew he was valued and loved, greeting him each evening with genuine joy, making their home a place of warmth and comfort he could look forward to returning to. They stayed close with their friends from the Rocking K and Monticello. Elizabeth and Mr. Kelton became like family, often visiting for Sunday dinners and offering advice when needed. Maria and Miguel were frequent visitors as well. Miguel sometimes helping Grant with projects around the ranch, while Maria taught Frances new recipes and remedies. In the spring of 1879, 2 years after their wedding, Frances discovered she was expecting their first child. Grant was overjoyed, immediately becoming protective and insisting that Frances rest more and let him take on additional household chores. "I am pregnant, not broken," Frances laughed when Grant tried to prevent her from carrying a basket of laundry. "Women have been doing this since the beginning of time." "Not my wife," Grant said stubbornly. "You are too important to take chances with." Their son was born in December of 1879, arriving during a cold snap that left frost on the windows and ice in the water buckets. Grant paced anxiously outside, while Maria and Elizabeth attended to Frances, and when he finally heard the baby's first cry, he practically burst through the door. "It is a boy," Elizabeth announced, beaming. "A healthy, strong boy." Grant approached the bed where Frances lay exhausted but smiling, holding their newborn son wrapped in a soft blanket. "He is perfect," Grant whispered, touching the baby's tiny hand with one gentle finger. "You are amazing, Frances. Look what you made." "We made," Frances corrected, looking up at her husband with tired but happy eyes. "Together." They named him Thomas Edwin. Thomas for the Rocking K foreman, who had been such a good friend to Grant, and Edwin for Frances's uncle, despite everything. Frances said she wanted to remember that even hard choices sometimes came from a place of necessity, and that dwelling on past hurts would not help them build their future. Grant proved to be a devoted father, just as Francis had known he would be. He would spend hours playing with Tommy, talking to him even when the baby was too young to understand, taking him out to see the horses and cattle as soon as he was old enough to be carried in a sling. "You are going to spoil him," Francis said one evening, watching Grant cradle their sleeping son. "Good," Grant replied. "He should know he is loved and wanted every single day of his life. Should never have to doubt it for a moment." In 1881, their daughter arrived, a tiny girl with her mother's green eyes and her father's dark hair. They named her Caroline Rose, and she proved to have a sunny disposition that charmed everyone who met her. Tommy, now a toddler, was fascinated by his baby sister and wanted to help with everything, from changing her nappies to feeding her bottles of milk. The ranch continued to grow slowly, but steadily. By the mid-1880s, Grant and Francis had built their herd to nearly 100 head of cattle and had acquired more land, expanding their property to 500 acres. They hired a young cowhand to help Grant with the work, a quiet boy named James, who reminded Francis a bit of how Grant must have been at that age, alone and looking for a place to belong. "You are taking in strays again," Francis teased Grant when he announced he had hired James. "Says the stray I took in," Grant replied with a grin, pulling her close for a kiss. "I prefer to think of myself as a very fortunate find. The most fortunate find of my life." As their children grew, Francis made sure to tell them the story of how their parents met, how their father had turned back to help someone in need, and how that act of kindness had changed both their lives forever. "So Papa saved you?" Tommy asked when he was about 6 years old, listening to the story with wide eyes. "In a way, yes," Francis said. "But it was not just about saving my life. It was about showing me that I mattered, that I was worth caring about. Your father taught me that kindness and compassion are the most important things in the world." "I want to be kind like Papa," Tommy declared. "Then you will be a very good man indeed," Francis said, smoothing his dark hair back from his forehead. In 1887, Francis gave birth to their third child, another son they named Samuel Pierce, after the man who had sold them their original property. Samuel was a quiet, thoughtful child who seemed to prefer observing the world around him to jumping into the middle of things like his older siblings. The ranch continued to prosper, and by the 1890s, Grant and Francis had achieved a level of financial stability they had only dreamed of in those early years. Their home had been expanded and improved, they had a solid barn and good outbuildings, and their herd had grown large enough to provide a comfortable living. But despite their material success, Grant and Francis never forgot where they had come from, or how easily things could have turned out differently. They made a point of helping others when they could, offering work to those who needed it, providing meals to travelers passing through, contributing to the church and community in Monticello. "We were given a second chance," Francis said once when Grant questioned whether they could afford to be quite so generous. "How can we not do the same for others?" Grant pulled her into his arms, resting his chin on top of her head. "You are absolutely right. I just want to make sure we are taking care of our own family first." "Our family is fine," Francis assured him. "More than fine. We have everything we need and so much more. The least we can do is share some of that blessing." As the children grew older, they each developed their own interests and personalities. Tommy, the eldest, was drawn to ranching life like his father, spending every moment he could out with the cattle and horses. Caroline was more interested in domestic pursuits, learning to sew and cook and run a household from her mother. Samuel surprised everyone by developing a love of reading and learning, eventually deciding he wanted to be a teacher. Grant and Francis supported each of their children's dreams, even when it meant letting them go their own way. When Samuel left to attend normal school in Salt Lake City in 1899, Francis cried as she hugged him goodbye, but she was proud of his determination to make his own path. "He is so young," she said to Grant that evening as they sat on their porch watching the sunset. "He is 18, Grant reminded her. "The same age you were when your wagon train left you in Monticello." Francis leaned against her husband's shoulder, thinking about that frightened, sick girl she had been so long ago. "I suppose you were right. And look how things turned out for me." "Because you were brave enough to keep fighting," Grant said, kissing the top of her head. "Samuel has that same strength. He will be fine." As the new century arrived, Grant and Francis found themselves in their early 40s, with a grown son working the ranch alongside his father, a daughter preparing for her own wedding, and another son pursuing his education. They had built a successful ranch, raised 3 good children, and created a life together that was everything they had hoped for and more. But most importantly, they still loved each other as deeply as they had that day in Monticello when Grant had appeared beside Frances's sickbed and promised to help her get better. They still held hands when they sat on their porch in the evenings. They still made each other laugh. They still looked at each other with the same warmth and affection that had characterized their relationship from the beginning. One evening in the spring of 1902, Frances and Grant sat together on their porch watching the sun set over the red cliffs, just as they had done countless times over the past 25 years of marriage. Their hair was touched with gray now, and there were lines around their eyes and mouths, but they still moved together with the easy comfort of two people who knew each other completely. "Do you ever think about that day?" Frances asked softly. "The day you came to the trading post and found me there?" "I think about it often," Grant admitted. "I think about how close I came to not stopping, to just letting someone else handle it. I was tired and ready to get back to work, and it would have been easier to pretend I had not heard about you. But you did not pretend." "No, I did not. And thank God for that, because I cannot imagine my life without you in it. You are everything to me, Frances. Everything good in my life started that day when I decided to turn back and help." Frances reached over and took his hand, lacing their fingers together. "You gave me my life back, Grant. Not just by nursing me through the fever, but by showing me what it means to be truly loved and valued. You never made me feel like a burden or an obligation. You made me feel cherished. Because you are," Grant said simply. "You always have been, from that very first day." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the stars begin to appear in the darkening sky. In the distance, they could hear Tommy calling the cattle, the sound carrying clearly in the evening air. Closer to the house, they could see lights in the windows where Caroline was preparing dinner with her fiancé, a young rancher from a neighboring property who reminded Grant of himself at that age. "We have built a good life," Frances said contentedly. "The best life," Grant agreed. "And it all started because I was stubborn enough to turn back when everyone else moved on." "I will be grateful for that stubbornness every day for the rest of my life," Frances said, leaning her head against his shoulder. Grant wrapped his arm around his wife, holding her close as the last light faded from the sky and the stars came out in full glory overhead. He thought about that dusty trading post in Monticello, about the fevered young woman he had found there, about the decision he had made to help her when no one else would. It had seemed like such a simple choice at the time, just basic human decency. But that one decision had given him everything that mattered: a wife he adored, children he was proud of, a home and a life that filled him with satisfaction and joy. "I love you, Frances," he said quietly. "I love you too, Grant, always and forever." As they sat together under the stars, surrounded by the life they had built with their own hands and sustained with their devotion to each other, both Grant and Frances knew they had been given something precious and rare. They had found each other in the most unlikely of circumstances, and they had turned that chance meeting into a lifetime of love and partnership. The wagon train that had left Frances behind had moved on to California, chasing dreams that may or may not have materialized. But Frances had found something better right here in the red rock country of southeastern Utah. She had found a man who saw her worth when she was at her lowest, who stood by her when she had nothing to offer, who built a life with her based on mutual respect and deep, abiding love. And Grant had found the missing piece of himself, the person who made him want to be better, who gave him a reason to work hard and dream big, who created a home that was always warm and welcoming, no matter what challenges they faced. Together, they had created something that would last long after they were gone. Their children would carry forward the values they had instilled, the belief in kindness and hard work, and looking out for those in need. Their ranch would remain in the family for generations, a testament to what two people could build when they refused to give up on each other. Years later, when Frances was an old woman with silver hair and great-grandchildren playing at her feet, people would sometimes ask her about the secret to a long and happy marriage. She would smile and take her husband's hand, weathered and gnarled with age but still strong, and she would say, "Find someone who will turn back for you when everyone else moves on. Find someone who sees your worth even when you cannot see it yourself. Find someone who chooses you every single day, not because they have to, but because they want to." And Grant, sitting beside her as he always had, would squeeze her hand and add, "And then choose them back, just as hard." every single day. Because that was what they had done, day after day, year after year, through good times and hard times, through sickness and health, through all the challenges and joys that life had brought them. They had chosen each other, and they had built a life together that was worth every struggle, every sacrifice, every moment of doubt. The fever that had nearly killed Frances in the summer of 1877 had instead become the catalyst for the greatest blessing of her life. The cowboy who had turned around when everyone else moved on had given her not just survival, but a reason to live, and eventually, a love that lasted a lifetime. And in the end, that was all that really mattered. Not the hardships they had overcome, or the success they had achieved, but the love they had shared, and the family they had created, and the life they had built together. One day at a time, one choice at a time, one moment of turning back at a time. Their story became a legend in the area around Monticello, told and retold to illustrate the power of compassion and the unpredictable ways that love can find us. Young people hearing the story would think about the choices they made, about whether they turned back or moved on when someone needed help, about what kind of person they wanted to be. And somewhere, somehow, the world became just a little bit better, because one cowboy had decided to turn back, and one young woman had been brave enough to accept his help, and eventually his love. Their legacy lived on, not just in their children and grandchildren, but in every act of kindness inspired by their story, every person who chose compassion over convenience, every love that bloomed from the most unlikely of beginnings. On a warm May evening in 1927, exactly 50 years after their wedding day, Grant and Frances celebrated their golden anniversary surrounded by their children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren. The celebration was held at the ranch, which was now run by Tommy and his sons, though Grant still liked to ride out with the cattle when his health permitted. As the party wound down and the younger children were being put to bed, Grant and Frances slipped away to their favorite spot on the porch, the same place they had sat so many evenings over the past half-century. 50 years, Frances marveled, looking at their joined hands. Hers was spotted with age now, the skin thin and delicate, but Grant still held it as carefully as if it were made of porcelain. When you first found me in that trading post, I never imagined we would have this, that I would live long enough to see my great-grandchildren. You were always a fighter, Grant said, his voice rougher with age, but still warm when he spoke to her. From that first moment when you opened your eyes and looked at me like you were daring the fever to take you. I knew then you were special. I think you are remembering it more romantically than it actually was, Frances laughed. I was probably delirious. Maybe, Grant conceded. But I was not. I remember looking at you and thinking that you deserve better than to die alone in a strange place. And then, as I got to know you, I started thinking you deserved so much more than that. You deserved everything good that life could offer. You gave me everything good, Frances said softly. You gave me a life I never thought I would have, a home, a family, love that never wavered even when things were hard. I was so lost when my uncle left me behind, Grant. I thought my life was over, and in a way it was. But you helped me build a new life, a better life, from those ashes. Grant lifted her hand to his lips, kissing it gently, just as he had done that evening at the church social so many years ago. You built it just as much as I did. More, really. You made our house a home. You raised our children to be good people. You stood beside me through droughts and hard winters and cattle diseases and all the other challenges we faced. I could not have done any of this without you. We did it together, Frances said firmly, just like we have always done everything. Together. As the stars came out overhead and a gentle breeze carried the scent of sage and wildflowers, Grant and Frances sat together in the comfortable silence of two people who no longer needed words to communicate. They had said everything that needed saying over the course of 50 years together. Now it was enough to simply be, to exist in each other's presence, to feel the warmth of a hand held and a love that time had only strengthened. Inside the house, their legacy continued. Children laughed and played, recipes were shared, stories were told. The ranch that Grant and Frances had built with their own hands and sustained through their devotion continued to thrive, now in its third generation of family stewardship. And somewhere, in the vast sweep of the Utah desert night, the spirits of kindness and compassion that had brought them together still lingered, still touched the lives of those who were open to them. still reminded people that the choice to turn back, to help, to care, could change everything. Grant and Frances Owens had proven that love could bloom in the most unlikely places, that second chances were real, and that the choice to show compassion to a stranger could lead to a lifetime of joy. Their story was written not just in words passed down through generations, but in the very fabric of the land they had worked, the home they had built, and the lives they had touched. As they sat together under the stars on their 50th anniversary, they knew their time was growing shorter, but they faced the future without fear, knowing they had lived fully, loved deeply, and created something that would endure long after they were gone. "Thank you," Frances whispered as the night grew darker around them. "For what?" Grant asked, though he knew the answer. "For turning back, for choosing me, for every single day of these 50 years. "Thank you for letting me," Grant replied, "for choosing me back, for building this life with me." They sat together until the stars filled the sky from horizon to horizon, until the night grew cool and Frances shivered slightly. Then Grant helped her to her feet, and they walked together into their home, their hands still clasped, their hearts still bound by the love that had started with one cowboy's decision to turn back when everyone else moved on. And in the morning, they would wake up together once more, ready to face another day side by side, just as they had done for 50 years, just as they would continue to do for whatever time remained. Because that was what they did. That was what they had always done. They chose each other again and again and again, from that first moment in a dusty trading post in Monticello all the way to the golden years of their marriage. They turned back for each other over and over, in ways both large and small, creating a love story that would be remembered and cherished long after they were gone. And that, in the end, was the greatest legacy they could leave behind. Not wealth or land or possessions, but the proof that love could conquer any obstacle, that kindness could change lives, and that the choice to help someone in need could lead to the greatest rewards of all. They had lived that truth every day of their lives together, and their story would continue to inspire others to do the same, generation after generation, forever.